So in the beginning of class, we talked about how a computer program is essentially input some data, processing that data, and then we're going to output that data. That's what computers do. They process data that we bring into the program, and then we get new data after processing that we output to the program. So far, our input has come from the keyboard, and our output has really gone to the screen monitor essentially. But there are lots of other input and output devices, especially nowadays. We've got, in addition to mice, we have touch screens and sensors and all sorts of different ways to get input into the computer, and we can output in a lot of different ways. We didn't just output to the screen, we also output to the computer speakers when we made some music. But there are other ways to output data as well. So we're going to get an additional way in this course, and that's files. We're going to be able to take data from a file as input. We can process that data, and we could output some more data to the screen, and we could also output data to a file as well. When we're talking about files, we're primarily talking about simple files like text files, CSV files. These are really simple spreadsheet files. This stands for comma separated values, but we could do also XML files, JSON files. Python allows us a number of different file types that we can read in the data from that file, be able to process it, and do things with that data. And so we're going to primarily focus on text files and CSV files, being able to pull data from these files into our programs, do something with that data in our programs, and then outputting it to another file or to the screen. Python makes reading and writing from files fairly straightforward. Let's say we have some sort of file. We might have, my file dot txt, or we might have, my file dot csv. We have the name of our file, and with Python, the first thing we need to do is we need to open that file, and then we're going to read from the file. So the first thing we do is we create some sort of file object by opening it. So we're going to say, we're going to have a file object, and then we're actually going to use the open method in order to be able to open this file or this file. So let's say we're going to open up myfile.txt. If the text file is in the same folder as our .py file, as the file that contains our code, we can just use the file name. So myfile.txt, we're going to put that in quotes. We're going to send it the file name as a string, and then we're going to tell it how we want to open it. Our options are: we want to open it just to read it, we want to read what's in the file, we want to open it because we want to write to the file. This actually overwrites the contents of what's in the file. Or we can open it for appending, which keeps what's already in the file and adds to the end. So we use these when we're writing to the file. We use this when we're reading from the file. There's a couple other options. We won't use those in this class. This is pretty much all you need. So since we're going to start by reading it, we're going to open it in read mode. This is technically called the path, and as long as your file is in the same folder as your code, it's just the file name. However, if you have it somewhere else, you actually need to give the full path to where this file is located. And when I talk about path, we're talking about the file system, which means that this is going to differ depending on your operating system. So let's say, for instance, and we can take a look at this is a Windows machine. If I want to know how to find, let's let's find a particular file. We'll go here to CSU. Let's look at documents, and I've got all these recordings here in my Camtasia Studio. So basically my file is described here. I mean, I'm in the C drive, I'm in the users folder, I'm in the CSU folder, I'm in the documents folder, I'm in Camtasia Studio, and then maybe I'm going to come here to assignment 3, and then my file is assignment3.mp4. So we would actually have to specify this entire path name with the appropriate slashes in between each folder to specify where to find a particular file. This looks different in Linux. Linux doesn't have, has a completely different file structure than Windows does. It always goes from the root system. So also Macintosh has, Apple has a different file system. So the problem is if you specify a full-on path, and I'm using a Windows machine and you're using a Mac machine, the code won't run for me. So a good rule of thumb, especially in these introductory classes, let's just make sure everything's going to work. Instead of worrying about the path, just make sure your files, any files that you're using, just like you did for your animation, you made sure that your GIF images, however you want to say it, is in the same folder as your code. When we're working with files, we're going to do the same for now. We're going to make sure that our text files, our CSV files, whatever type of files we're using, are going to be in the same folder as our code. And in that case, your path is just the file name. So we open up the object, or we open up the file in read mode. We store this in a variable. So we have a file object. And then on this file object, we have several options. 3, essentially. We can read from that file, so we can say fo dot read. We could read a line, a single line, read line from that file, or we can read lines. These are your 3 options for reading from a file. I mean, there's others. We could use libraries for opening files and handling files. We're not going to worry about that in this class. We're just going to use the built-in operations, and you end up with 3 options. Read is going to pull in the whole file as one string. Read line is usually used with a for loop or a while loop, and this is going to read in one line at a time as a string. Read lines is going to bring in your entire file as a list where each line of that file is a string. So it's basically a list of strings. So these are your 3 options for reading to a file. Writing to a file is the same. You have to open. You're going to open it in either write mode or append mode, but all you have is the dot write function. That's it. You have your file object, and you're going to put in here whatever it is you want to write. So, your string, big string, long string, however you want to do it. It's a string that you're going to write to it. So we would have file fo.write, and we could call this whatever we want. My file object, file, you'll see a lot. You'll see f a lot, but this is really our options. We open our file in the correct mode, save it into a file object. If we're reading, we have 3 options for reading. If we're writing, we have one function to write with, but we have 2 options for the mode we open it in. Write mode overwrites whatever's in the file. Append mode will add to the end of whatever in the file. And whenever you are done with a file, you are always going to close it. So that's very important because you don't want to leave files hanging open in your RAM. That can cause some problems. So once you're done with a file, you're going to close it up. So let's write some code and see how this works in practice. So the Python documentation talks about how to read and write files and has information. Like I said, when we're using the built-in functionality. Just, we're opening a file, we've got just a few options for reading, a few options for writing, and then we're going to close that file up. This sort of goes over it and talks about some of the different options that you have beyond just the simple things that we're going to talk about in class. So don't forget, the Python documentation is a really good source of information. So let's practice what we're going to learn in this class. They were really focusing on just being able to open up files, being able to read from files, and then also being able to write from files. And of course, we always close files when we're done with it. So first of all, we got to create a file. So let's start with a text file, and you can use any text editor to create a text file. This is Notepad++. You can also just use plain old Notepad, TextPad, WordPad, even Microsoft Word will do text files. You just have to make sure that you save it as a .txt instead of a .doc. So we're going to go ahead and let's create a text file here, and let's just put in some stuff. So let's just do a list of words to start with, just something simple. Let's see, we've got cake, we're just coming up with desserts here. Ice cream, brownies. There we go. That should be plenty. All right, and then we're going to save this. So we're going to say save as, and I want to make sure that this is in the same place as my code. So I know that my code should be here. So I called my file fileio.py. So let's double check that I saved it in the right place. So fileio.py, I'm putting it all in the text on the desktop. Can't talk today. Putting it all in the desktop so that it's all in the same place. I don't have to worry about a path. The path is just the file name because they're in the same place. There is no path. The path is really to get from one file to the other, really from my code file to the other external files that I'm using. But if they're in the same place, the path is just the file name. I don't have to go out and find it in another location. I don't need a path. The path is just the file name. So let's call this our dessert file, and I'm saving it as a .txt. And so now I have this nice little text file that we can play with. All right, so let's use our new text file, and let's go ahead and put everything in a function, just so we're practicing good coding, and we can separate it out into other functions as we go along and write more code with this. But let's just start out with the main function, and a call to main, and the first thing I need to do is I need to actually open up my file. So we can call this, our file. This is what we're doing. We're creating a file object by using the open method to open up our file. And we're setting our file name as a string, and the first thing we're going to do is read it. So let's open it up in read mode. Just so we don't forget, let's go ahead and do file.close at the end, and then we're going to do stuff in the middle here, but when we're all done, we want to make sure that we close this file object, which is going to close up the file for us. So now if we're reading from our file, we have our three options. We can use read, we can use read line, and we can use read lines. So let's just see what happens if I were to print file.read. This should pull in everything from our file as a string, one solid string for the entire contents of the file. So if this file contained a book, for instance, it's going to take every single word in that book, and you're going to get it as one single string. And there's some times that's exactly what you want to do, and other times it's not. But here we go. So it's actually going to print, and it actually just prints the contents of the file. You should note that it's actually the string itself actually has the /n, the escape n, these return characters, because those are also in the text file. So I've actually put in an enter here. I hit the enter key. I don't see the /n, but it's actually there. So this is what it looks like when we just read it in as a string, and then we just go ahead and print that out. That's actually what we're going to see. All right, so let's see what read lines does instead. what we're going to get is we're actually going to get the contents of the file, and each line is going to be an element of a list. The whole file is going to be put into a list, and each line is going to be an element in that list. And you'll see here they actually do show you the /n because we ugly printed. We just printed the list instead of using a for loop. So you can actually see those /n's from this text file. But they're there here. When you pull it in as a string, those /n's are also there, but when I print it out, it actually interprets those /n's as enters and puts them on each line. If I were to do read line, in this case, I will just get the first line, just candy and the enter, because I only read one line at a time. So if I wanted to actually go through and use, I could use a for loop on this, and then I could get one line at a time and check for those. So this is pretty handy, but we almost always use read lines in a for loop, because if you use read line by itself, all you'll ever get is essentially just the first line of the file. So we could also write to this file. Let's do that. So we could put this in, let's try append mode, because this means I'm going to actually keep what's in the file, and I'm going to go ahead and close this up because it's going to get cranky if I don't. I can't try to write to an open file. So I'm going to try to append, and let's append another dessert. So we're going to say, I've opened this in append mode, so let's say file.write, and now let's write, what can I do? Let's put in some fudge at the end there. And what this is going to do, I do believe, because brownies doesn't have an enter after it, this is actually going to just put it right next to brownies. Let's try this. All right, so we've run this. So now we can go ahead and open, and let's open from our desktop, and we're going to look for dessert file, and yep, because brownie didn't have an enter after it, it put brownies fudge together. So if I had wanted, so let's go ahead and get rid of this, and we're going to save it again, and we're going to go ahead and close it. So now if I were to do this, we can do escape N. I always forget which direction it goes. Of course it goes the other way. There we go. And let's run this, save it. This ran correctly. And so now let's go ahead and open our file up again. We'll go to the desktop. Let's find desserts. And now it put in the enter and put fudge on the next line. There's no enter in here, so if we wanted to add something else, we would need to do that. So these are just the very, very basics of what you can do. We have read lines, read line, and being able to write. If I were to do this in W mode, this would actually erase everything from this file and just put in whatever I wrote to it. So play around with these. Practice with these. We have 2 weeks to work with files. This week, really just kind of get down the basics, kind of learn how it works. And then as we pull things in, you'll notice we really have 2 options. One, we're pulling it in as a string. One, we're pulling it in as a list of strings. So of course, what we're also going to practice this week is a whole lot of how do we process those strings? How do we process those lists of strings once we've pulled them in from a file? So you will have plenty of practice with that. And happy programming. Let me know if you need any help.